There is a phrase so common in Christian circles that most people stopped hearing it years ago. You have seen it on bumper stickers. You have heard it at the end of sermons. You have probably said it yourself, maybe this week. Just have faith. And nobody questions it, because it sounds right. It sounds humble. It sounds like the kind of thing a serious believer is supposed to say. But here's a question almost nobody asks. Faith in what, exactly? Faith that God exists? Faith that the Bible is true? Faith that things will work out? Because those are not the same thing. And the difference between them is not a minor theological footnote. It is the difference between a life that moves and a life that stalls. Between a Christianity that costs you something and one that costs you nothing. Between the faith that saves and the faith that, according to James, is dead. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. There are two ways people relate to faith in the Christian life. The first is living by faith, holding faith as a doctrinal position, a theological category, something you possess and affirm and defend. The second is walking by faith, faith as motion, as risk, as daily obedience that puts something on the line. Most Christians are doing the first and calling it the second, and the confusion is not harmless. Start with the phrase itself, because the Bible actually uses both constructions, and they are not interchangeable. Paul writes in Romans 1:17, "The righteous shall live by faith." He writes in 2 Corinthians 5-7, "We walk by faith, not by sight." Same author, same letter collection, different word. In Greek, the word for live, in Romans 1, is the word for existence, for the condition of being alive. The word for walk in 2 Corinthians is peripatio, a word that appears dozens of times in the New Testament. It means to move through, to conduct oneself, to go somewhere step by step. Living by faith is the ground you stand on. Walking by faith is what you do with your feet. And here is where the confusion sets in, because most people treat them as the same statement wearing different clothes. They hear walk by faith and translate it immediately into believe the right things. They turn a verb of motion into a noun of possession. And the result is a Christianity that is deeply, sincerely convinced of all the correct doctrines and completely stationary. Think about Abraham, because Paul does, repeatedly, when he wants to explain what faith actually looks like in a human life. Hebrews 11:8 puts it plainly. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Read that last clause carefully. Not knowing where he was going. This is the detail that gets smoothed over in Sunday school versions of the story. Abraham did not receive a detailed itinerary. He did not get a map, a timeline, a 5-year plan, or a guaranteed outcome. He got a direction and a voice, and he packed his things and moved. The faith came first. The knowing came later. In that order, always in that order. And here is what makes that remarkable. Abraham was not a young man with nothing to lose. He was 75 years old. He had land, livestock, wealth, a household staff, and deep roots in Haran. Everything he had built over a lifetime was in one place, and God's instruction was essentially, leave it, all of it. Go to a country I will show you, which is a sentence that tells you almost nothing useful if you are trying to plan a route. There was no name given, no distance, no timeline for arrival, just a promise attached to a direction, and a man who decided that was enough to move on. That decision cost him something real and visible in exchange for something real but invisible. That is the precise texture of walking faith. The cost is concrete. The return is promised, and the gap between them is where trust actually lives, not as a feeling, but as a step. Now ask yourself an honest question. When was the last time your faith required you not to know something? When did you last make a decision that was genuinely, structurally dependent on God coming through, where if God didn't come through, you were in real trouble? No backup plan, no hedge, no rational fallback that would have kept things reasonably intact regardless? If the answer is a long pause followed by silence, that is not a judgment. It is diagnostic information. This is where living by faith and walking by faith divide most clearly. Living by faith is compatible with complete safety. You can hold every orthodox theological position, attend every service, tithe faithfully, lead a small group, and never once be in a position where your faith was the thing standing between you and collapse. The beliefs are real. The commitment is real. But the walk has been carefully arranged so that nothing actually depends on God moving. Walking by faith requires exposure. Peter, standing in the boat at 3 a.m, watching a figure move across the water, asks to come out. Jesus says, "Come." And Peter steps over the side of the boat into the dark. That is walking by faith. It is also the moment he becomes the only human being in recorded history, other than Christ himself, to walk on water. But notice what had to happen first. He had to leave the boat. The boat that was already in the middle of a storm, yes, but still a boat, still wood and hull and something between him and the Sea of Galilee. The other 11 stayed in the boat. They had faith. They believed Jesus was out there. They watched the whole thing, but only one of them got wet feet, and only one of them walked on water. The church has produced generations of people who are extraordinarily good at believing and extraordinarily reluctant to move. And this is not entirely their fault, because there is a version of Christian teaching that has accidentally trained people to confuse conviction with obedience, to treat agreement as action, to count doctrinal fidelity as a substitute for actual steps. You can be completely convinced that God calls people to forgive and still carry a resentment you've had since 2011. You can fully believe God provides and still make every financial decision as if He doesn't. You can affirm that God directs paths and never once ask Him to direct yours because you've already decided where you're going and you'd prefer His blessing on the plan you've made. This is not hypocrisy in the bitter, cynical sense of the word. It is something more ordinary and more dangerous. It is the natural resting state of a faith that has been intellectualized but never activated. James saw it clearly enough to write one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the New Testament about it. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? James 2:14. Note that he doesn't say if someone has no faith. He says if someone claims to have faith. The claim is there. The language is there. What James is examining is whether anything in the person's actual life is moving because of it. His illustration is brutal in its simplicity. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food, and you say, "Go in peace, warm yourself, and be well fed," but do nothing about their physical needs. What good is that? James 2:15, 1:6. The person said the right thing. The sentiment was genuine. The wish for the other person's well-being was probably real. But nothing moved. Nothing was given. Nothing changed. And James calls that faith dead. Not weak, not immature, dead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now here is where it gets complicated, because the opposite error exists, and it is equally destructive. There is a version of walking by faith that has been weaponized into recklessness. It shows up in the theology that says if you just believe hard enough, God is obligated to produce the outcome you want. It shows up in the pastor who tells a congregation to empty their bank accounts because their financial breakthrough is coming. And what looks like obedience is actually manipulation in spiritual clothing. It shows up every time someone makes a catastrophically unwise decision and then labels the disaster that follows as persecution rather than consequence. This is not walking by faith. This is testing God, which is a different thing entirely, and one that Scripture explicitly forbids. The difference comes down to the source of the movement. Walking by faith means you move because God has spoken, because there is a clear conviction, a genuine call, a word confirmed by Scripture and tested by community and prayer. It means the movement is towards something God has initiated, not something you have decided and then recruited God to endorse. Abraham went because God said go. He didn't decide he wanted an adventure and ask God to bless the destination he'd already chosen. The call came first. The step followed. This is the test. Who spoke first? Because if the answer is I did, and then I asked God to agree, that is not faith. That is preference wearing a prayer. There is a passage in John 5 that most people read as a healing story and move on from. Jesus approaches a man who has been lying beside the pool of Bethesda for 38 years, waiting for the water to be stirred so he could get in and be healed. Jesus asks him a question that ought to stop every reader cold. Do you want to get well? John 5-6. On the surface, the question seems almost unkind. The man is lying beside a healing pool. He has been there for 38 years. Of course he wants to get well. But Jesus asks it anyway, because the question is not what it appears to be. Look at the man's answer. He does not say yes. He says, "Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." John 5-7. He answered a question about desire with an explanation about obstacles. Jesus asked what he wanted. The man explained why he hadn't gotten it yet. 38 years of waiting had trained him to think entirely in terms of the problem. His frame of reference had become the gap between himself and the water, and everyone who kept getting there before him. At some point, the waiting stopped being a season and became a permanent address. There are people who have organized their entire lives around their condition. The sickness, the wound, the limitation has become identity. It has become the reason for every failure, the explanation for every disappointment, the thing that makes them an object of sympathy rather than an agent of decision. And the thought of getting well, of losing the excuse, of having to stand up and walk and be responsible for what happens next, is more frightening than the mat. 38 years is a long time to lie down. It is also a long time to build a life around lying down. The mat becomes familiar. The poolside becomes home. The waiting becomes, quietly, a way of existing that requires nothing and risks nothing. Jesus does not heal the man first, and then ask him to walk. He tells him to get up, take his mat, and walk. The action precedes the full manifestation of the healing. The man had to put weight on legs he had not stood on in nearly 4 decades before he had any confirmation that they would hold. That is walking by faith. Movement toward what God has spoken before you can see all the evidence that it is going to work. And he got up. The text says it simply, almost without drama. He picked up his mat and walked. Do not let the simplicity of the sentence flatten what it cost him to attempt it. Here is the practical question, and it deserves a direct answer. How do you know if you are living by faith or walking by faith? Not in theory. In your actual life, this week, is there anything in your life right now that is moving because you believe God that would stop moving if He didn't come through? Is there a conversation you are in the middle of because God asked you to have it, one you would have avoided without that prompting? Is there a financial decision you have made that required trusting God's provision rather than your own calculation? Is there a relationship you are investing in because you believe God called you to it, not because it is comfortable or reciprocal? If your faith is not currently costing you anything, if it is not producing any motion, if the practical shape of your week would look essentially the same whether you believed deeply or not, that is important information, not condemnation. Information. Because you cannot walk to a destination you are not moving toward. The Israelites in the wilderness are the long, painful portrait of this tension. They had seen God part the Red Sea. They had eaten bread that appeared on the ground every morning. They had followed a pillar of fire through darkness. Their belief was not irrational. The evidence behind their faith was overwhelming. And yet, when they reached the border of Canaan, when the moment came to actually walk into what God had promised, 10 of the 12 spies came back saying the same thing dressed in different words. We believe God, but the giants are real and we are grasshoppers. Numbers 13:33. Their belief was genuine. Their assessment of the giants was accurate, but the belief stopped at the border, and God called it unbelief. Not because they doubted the facts, but because the facts became the reason not to move. They had seen enough of God to trust Him in the wilderness, where the daily manna meant they never had to plan beyond breakfast. But Canaan required a different kind of trust. It required them to walk into a fight they could not win on their own, toward land that was already occupied, armed with a promise rather than a strategy. That is a harder ask, and they refused it. The man at Bethesda had 38 years of evidence that his condition was permanent. The Israelites had giants they could measure against their own height. Neither obstacle was imaginary. Faith that walks does not require the obstacle to disappear first. It requires a decision that the one who called you into motion is larger than what is standing in the way. Paul's phrase from 2 Corinthians 5 is worth sitting inside for a moment longer. We walk by faith, not by sight. The contrast is not faith versus doubt. It is faith versus sight. Sight is the evidence already in hand, the guarantee already secured, the outcome already visible. Walking by sight is the completely rational, completely human instinct to move only when you can see where you are going, to commit only when the result is already probable, to give only when the return is already assured. Faith is not the absence of evidence. Paul is not telling the Corinthians to be irrational. He is telling them that there is a category of movement that cannot wait for sight, because the thing you are walking toward cannot be seen until you are closer to it than you currently are. You do not see the destination from the starting line. You see it from the road. This is why faith and obedience are so inseparable in Scripture that you cannot meaningfully discuss one without the other. Every time someone in the Bible walks by faith, there is an action attached. Noah builds a boat. Abraham leaves his country. Moses raises a staff over the water. Mary says, "Let it be to me according to your word." Living by faith can exist entirely inside the mind. Walking by faith always leaves a mark on the calendar, the bank account, the relationship, the conversation. Walking by faith does not mean you will not be afraid. Gideon was afraid. He asked for not one confirming sign but two, and God gave them both without irritation. Jeremiah told God he was too young and didn't know how to speak. Elijah, directly after one of the most dramatic demonstrations of divine power in the Old Testament, sat under a broom tree and asked God to let him die. These are not the stories of people who had fear fully resolved before they moved. They are the stories of people who moved before the fear resolved, who discovered, as you only can discover by walking, that God meets you on the road, not at the starting line. The enemy of walking faith is not honest doubt or genuine wrestling. It is the settled decision to stay comfortable, dressed up as wisdom, dressed up as waiting on God, until the moment has passed and the door has closed and the only thing left is the very safe, very stationary explanation of why this particular step was never quite the right time. You already know which area of your life this is about. There is something God has been speaking to you about, something that requires movement, something that would cost you something real if you actually did it. And you have been living by faith about it, believing the right things, praying the right prayers, while keeping both feet exactly where they are. Abraham did not know where he was going. He went anyway. The writer of Hebrews says he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He wasn't walking blindly. He was walking towards something more permanent than anything he could see. The destination was real. The road was uncertain, and he walked it anyway. The difference between living by faith and walking by faith is not a difference in what you believe. It is a difference in what your feet are doing. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, and tomorrow, more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.